lonely farmer, didn't know how a woman's touch felt until an Apache woman came to his farm. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The land lay flat and brittle under the Arizona sun. Heat shimmered above the hard soil, and the only sound was the steady crunch of boots as Ethan Cole walked the far fence line of his property. His rifle hung from his hand, barrel angled down, more from habit than threat. He checked the posts one by one, tugging at the wire to be certain it still held. This was his life: dirt, sweat, and silence. Nothing moved out here but wind and livestock, and he liked it that way. Ethan was 29 years old and had worked this patch of land since his father's death 4 years back. His father had been a hard, joyless man who measured worth in labor and silence. Ethan had grown up without softness, without the company of women, without kindness except for the stubborn animals that depended on him. The people in town knew him as the quiet one. Kept to himself, said little, never sat long in the saloon or joined in laughter at the store porch. It had never been a choice exactly, only the way things had settled. Loneliness had hardened into routine. Today he was tired. Days of hot wind had stripped the ground of moisture, and the cattle had been restless the night before. He was thinking about how many posts he would have to replace come autumn when he saw something ahead, lying near the wash at the far boundary. A shape. At first, his shoulders stiffened and his hand gripped the rifle tighter. Out here, anything unexpected was trouble. He slowed, eyes scanning the brush and the ridges beyond. His heart kicked against his ribs, not fast but heavy, as he measured the scene the way his father had taught him. One shape in the open could mean more hiding. His gaze combed the mesquite and the rocks for movement, for the glint of metal. Nothing. The land was empty except for the hunched figure sprawled on the ground. Step by step, Ethan closed in. The closer he came, the clearer it became that the figure was a woman. She lay on her side, face turned toward the dirt, black hair tangled with strips of leather and dust. Her dress, deerskin by the look of it, was torn open at the seams, the neckline stretched and loose across her chest, exposing bare skin where it had given way. The skirt was ripped high, showing the bronze of her thighs and the bruises along her knees. Her feet were bare, cut and bloodied, toes swollen for miles walked on rock and sand. Ethan raised the rifle halfway, then hesitated. She didn't move. Her body shifted only with shallow breaths, ribs lifting weakly under the dirt-stained dress. If this was bait, it was a cruel piece of it. He swallowed, the taste of grit dry in his mouth. His instinct was to leave her. He told himself she might be part of a trick. Bandits used women sometimes, left them to die so that fools would stop. His father's voice still echoed in his head. You stop for strangers, you don't live long. But as Ethan studied her, doubt pulled harder. She was too far gone for pretense. Her lips were split, her eyes barely slits, her arm tucked beneath her head like she hadn't had the strength to move it. He cursed under his breath, lowered the rifle, and crouched beside her. His hand brushed her wrist. The pulse was there, fast, fragile, like a bird's heart beating against his fingers. His jaw tightened. If he walked away now, she wouldn't see another hour. He looked at the horizon one last time, then shifted her into the shade of a mesquite. Her body was light, far too light. He pulled the tin cup from his belt, poured water, and tipped it against her lips. At first the water spilled down her chin. Then her throat worked, and she swallowed twice before coughing weakly. Her eyes cracked open, dark and unfocused. That's enough, Ethan muttered, steadying her head. He gave her another sip, slower this time. She drank, then let her head fall against the ground. He tore a piece of bread from the pouch on his belt and set it near her hand. She didn't reach for it. He guessed she couldn't yet. His stomach tightened, a mix of pity and wariness. He sat back on his heels, rifle resting across his thighs, watching her with the caution of a man who had only known danger from strangers. She didn't speak. Her breathing steadied slightly, but her eyes closed again. Ethan stayed there until the sun began to drop, weighing his choices. He could leave her, keep his life simple, or he could take her closer to the farm. His chest ached with the decision. He had never brought anyone to his home, not a friend, not a woman, not anyone. That land was his only safe ground. But he looked at her again, skin cracked from thirst, body broken from walking, pride still faintly in her face even in weakness. And he knew he couldn't leave her. He lifted her into his arms. She was warm from the sun, almost burning to the touch, and her head dropped against his shoulder. He carried her across the yard and laid her on a horse blanket beside the barn. He didn't take her into his house. Not yet. That step was too large. He stacked straw to break the wind, lit a small fire, and covered her with his coat. That night he lay awake inside, only the barn wall between them. He kept the rifle close. But what unsettled him most wasn't fear of danger. It was the thought that for the first time in his life, there was a woman close enough that he could hear her breathing in the dark. Morning broke pale and quiet, the kind of desert dawn where the air carried a chill before the sun reclaimed it. Ethan stepped out of the house, boots crunching over the yard dirt, and turned his eyes toward the barn. He had not slept much. Every small sound in the night had carried sharper. Her faint coughing, the creak of boards, the horse shifting. He had kept the rifle within arm's reach, though he knew by now she wasn't a threat. What unsettled him wasn't danger, but the strangeness of another presence in his world. When he reached the barn wall, she was already stirring. The woman's eyes blinked open slowly, unfocused at first, then sharper when she noticed him standing there. She tried to push herself upright and winced, her bare feet dragging against the dirt. Ethan crouched, placing a tin plate on the ground between them, bread, a boiled potato, a small cup of water. "Eat," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her hands trembled when she reached for the cup, but she lifted it without spilling. She drank in small, steady sips, careful as if she knew wasting a drop would be unforgivable. When she set it down, she glanced at the bread and potato. She broke the potato with her fingers, ate slowly, not ravenous, but controlled. Ethan watched closely. Hunger-struck people usually tore at food. She didn't. That small restraint told him something. Pride, maybe discipline. He realized then he didn't know her name. Last night he hadn't thought to ask. He had been too occupied by the simple fact of her survival. Now, curiosity pressed. "What do they call you?" he asked. Her voice was low, rough, but steady enough. "Naira." He nodded once. "Ethan." She gave the smallest dip of her chin, acknowledging, then returned to eating. It was enough of an exchange to settle a first question. As the sun climbed, Ethan moved into the day's work. There were chores that couldn't wait, animals to feed, fences to check again. He expected her to stay by the barn, maybe rest longer, but when he looked back, he saw her rise slowly, still unsteady, and follow him a few steps. He stopped, wary. "You don't need to." "I can," she answered simply, and bent to gather the empty bucket he had set down by the pump. She staggered under the weight, but she did not complain. Ethan considered taking it back, but he let her carry it, watching the way her arms strained, the set of her jaw. She was weak, yet every movement carried stubbornness. By midday, she had fed the chickens with measured handfuls, stacked small logs near the porch, and returned the plate and cup washed in the basin. Ethan didn't comment, but he saw it all. For a woman left collapsed in the dust the day before, she worked with quiet dignity. Still, questions pressed at him, the kind that a listener would ask if the silence stretched too long. Who was she before she collapsed? Why was she alone in land that could kill a strong man within days? Was someone looking for her? Was she fleeing someone? When the work paused, he asked carefully, "Where's your family?" Naira didn't look at him right away. Her hands twisted the hem of her torn dress where the seam had ripped low across her chest. At last, she said, "Gone. Hard times." He waited, but she said nothing more. "And the settlements." Her mouth hardened. "I went. Asked for food." She paused, steadying her voice. "They laughed. Told me leave." Ethan's jaw clenched. He knew the kind of laughter she meant. He had felt its edge in town himself. Quiet men like him got dismissed easily enough, but a woman, an Apache woman, showing up hungry? He didn't have to imagine the scorn. That night, he didn't tell her to sleep inside. Not yet. But he gave her a better place. An old cot moved close to the barn wall, covered with blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. She touched the fabric slowly, like it was more than cloth, and lay down without a word. Ethan sat a while by the fire, rifle across his lap, watching the sparks float into the dark. Inside, later, he lay awake again. The questions chased him. Why had her people cast her out? Why had she risked the long walk toward white towns that would turn her away? Could she stay here, even for a little while, without drawing trouble to his land? And yet, beneath the worry, there was something else, something unfamiliar that made his stomach tighten whenever he thought of her. The way she met his eyes without fear, the careful way she worked though her body was weak, the shape of her shoulders in firelight when she bent to the basin. He told himself it was only caution that kept him so alert, only the need to watch over her until she moved on. But lying in the quiet, he knew it wasn't only that. For the first time in his life, there was someone else breathing in his world, and he couldn't turn from it. The next days carried a rhythm Ethan hadn't expected. Naira remained close to the barn and the yard, never wandering toward the road or the wash. She rose when he rose, worked when he worked, and moved through the day with a kind of quiet that matched his own. Still, the silence between them carried questions that pressed heavier each night. The kind listeners would be asking if they were watching the story unfold. Who exactly was this woman? How had she come so far alone? And why had she chosen his land to fall on? Ethan decided to ask when the chance came. He found her one morning crouched by the pump, sleeves of the torn dress rolled high, shoulders thin but strong as she hauled water. He studied her, wondering how she still had the strength to carry on after so much loss. His chest tightened as he spoke. Why here? Why my land? She looked at him, water dripping from her fingers into the dust. I walked until I could not. Her tone carried no apology. Your fence was the end of me. It was a plain answer, yet it held a weight Ethan understood. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen survival. That stung a little, though he would never admit it. He nodded once, satisfied but not settled. Later, as they worked side by side, he splitting fence rails, she gathering the smaller wood. Ethan pressed again with another thought that had lingered. Your people, why did they turn you away? For the first time, her hands stopped moving. She straightened, eyes fixed past him toward the dry horizon. Not enough food, not enough to share. She swallowed, voice low but firm. Some women are too many mouths when times are thin. She returned to her work without another word. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had known hunger, had seen it hollow faces in town, but he could not imagine being told you were no longer worth feeding. He wanted to ask more. Did she have family left, children, a husband? But the words stuck. They weren't close enough yet. By the third evening, Ethan noticed her sewing in the firelight. She had taken one of his old shirts, ripped at the sleeve, and was threading it back together with even stitches. He paused in the doorway, uneasy. Where'd you learn that? Naira didn't look up. My mother. A pause. Before she died. The answer hung in the air. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, shifting. He thought about his own mother, gone when he was a boy, and how little of her had remained in the house once his father's silence had taken over. He wondered, for the first time in years, what it might have been like to have a woman's presence steadying the corners of a home. That night, the questions listeners might still carry began to find answers in action. Would she stay outside forever? Would he keep her at the edge of his world, never inside? The sky answered first with a storm. Thunder rolled low, and rain came hard against the barn roof, leaking through the old seam. Ethan rushed out with a lantern, saw water pooling near the cot he had given her. She stood there, hair soaked loose, dress clinging against her ribs and hips. The sight jolted him, half from worry, half from the strange pull in his gut he was not used to. He didn't hesitate long. Come inside, he said, louder than he meant. She watched him for a breath, then nodded once, gathering the blanket around her shoulders. Inside, he cleared a space by the fire, brought out a wool throw, and handed her a tin cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and the contact lit a sharp heat in his chest. He stepped back quickly, unsettled by his own reaction. He busied himself with the kettle, though the truth was he had nothing more to do. She sat close to the flames, steam lifting from the damp cloth of her dress, eyes half closed with exhaustion. Ethan watched from across the room, torn between unease and something else he didn't want to name yet. He had never sat with a woman this way, never shared the simple space of a fire, the smell of wet hair, the sight of a figure that felt both fragile and steady. When she finally looked up at him, her expression was calm, unguarded. "Thank you," she said just that. Ethan shifted in his chair, nodding once. He didn't trust his voice. He only knew that something in the room had changed. The silence wasn't just caution anymore. It was beginning to hold the shape of something that could last. That night, while she slept by the hearth and he lay on his cot in the corner, Ethan kept his eyes on the ceiling. He knew the questions weren't over. There would be more. But for the first time since she had appeared at his fence line, he felt a strange certainty. He wasn't waiting for her to leave anymore. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air damp and cool, the yard scattered with broken branches and washed earth. Ethan stepped outside early, boots sinking into the softened ground, and looked over the farm. The barn roof still leaked where the seam had given out, and he made a note to patch it before the next rain. Inside the house, the fire still burned low, and Naira slept curled on the pallet he had given her by the hearth. Her hair had dried into loose waves across her shoulders, the blanket wrapped close around her. Ethan paused in the doorway, uneasy at the sight, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. For years, his mornings had been silent and solitary. Now, there was another breath in the room. He moved about quietly, setting a pan of beans on the fire, laying coffee to boil. When she stirred awake, she sat up slowly, cautious as if unsure whether she belonged here. Ethan noticed the hesitation. He realized he hadn't told her whether the house was temporary shelter or a place she was free to stay. Listeners might have asked the same. Was she meant to leave once she recovered, or was there a place for her here? Ethan didn't have the answer yet. "Coffee's hot," he said finally, not looking directly at her. He poured into a tin cup and set it down on the table. She rose, blanket still around her shoulders, and crossed the room barefoot. She didn't thank him this time, just took the cup with both hands and sipped slowly, steam rising into her face. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye, wondering how a woman cast out and left to collapse in the dust could still carry herself with that much quiet dignity. After breakfast, he headed out to mend the damage from the storm. He expected her to remain inside, still regaining strength, but minutes later she came out with the shovel in hand, hair tied back with a strip of leather, dress still torn but secured where the seams had ripped. She didn't ask what to do. She started clearing branches from the yard, dragging them into a pile. Ethan watched her for a moment, torn between telling her to rest and letting her prove herself. He said nothing, only returned to his work. Through the day, their silence was filled with shared labor. She steadied the ladder when he climbed to the barn roof. She gathered smaller sticks for kindling. At midday, she washed the basin and hung his shirts to dry, her movements careful and precise. Ethan found himself studying those movements, not just for the help they gave, but for what they told him. This wasn't a woman who begged or waited for charity. She made herself useful because it mattered to her pride. By late afternoon, when the sun slanted low, Ethan carried fresh water into the house. He found her sitting by the hearth, mending again, this time the tear in her own dress. The neckline was still low from where it had split, her shoulders bare where the fabric wouldn't reach, but her hands worked with steady skill. He realized he had never seen a woman's hands working so close in his home before. He cleared his throat, uneasy. "You plan to move on?" It was the question he hadn't voiced until now, the one anyone listening would expect to hear. Naira didn't answer immediately. She tied off a stitch, bit the thread short, and laid the garment across her knees. Only then did she meet his eyes. "I have nowhere to go." The truth of it landed hard. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. He had thought she might stay a few nights, recover strength, and leave when she could. But she wasn't just passing through. There was nowhere else for her. He shifted his weight, voice quieter. "This land's no easy place." "I know." Her tone carried no plea, only fact. "But it is better than being turned away." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. He didn't give her a promise, but he didn't send her off either. That was answer enough. That night, when the fire burned steady and the room was warm, he laid his cot back in the corner but didn't try to move her pallet away. He listened to the small sounds of her settling in, the soft rustle of the blanket, the quiet sigh as she stretched out, and something inside him shifted. For the first time, he felt not just responsibility for her survival, but the faint beginning of belonging, something he hadn't allowed himself to imagine before. As the flames flickered across the walls, Ethan turned the thought over in his mind. Naira wasn't leaving. She was part of this house now, even if neither of them had spoken aloud. And though he had spent his life believing silence kept him safe, he wondered if the silence they now shared might hold something else entirely. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ethan had never known before. For years, his life had been marked by the sound of his own boots in the yard, his own breath in the stillness of the house, his own hands carrying every load. Now there were two sets of footsteps, two sets of hands, and the silence no longer weighed so heavily. Naira moved through the house as if she had always belonged to it, though she did not presume. She cooked when he brought in provisions, patched his clothes without being asked, swept dust from corners that had long gone ignored. Each small act reminded him of how empty his life had been before she arrived. Ethan noticed questions hanging in the air, questions anyone watching might wonder. Did she intend to remain forever, or only until she could stand on her own again? Would people in town know she was here? And if they did, would that bring trouble? And most pressing for Ethan himself, what was happening between them, this pull he felt each time their eyes met? He carried those thoughts into the yard one morning as he split logs for the stove. Sweat ran down his back, and the sharp crack of the axe echoed off the barn. When he turned, Naira was there, stacking the split wood with careful precision. She worked in silence, her torn dress slipping lower at the neckline despite the mending she had done. Ethan looked away quickly, embarrassed by his own reaction, but the image stayed with him. He had never been so close to a woman, never felt the burn of wanting to look again while fighting the discipline to hold his eyes steady. By midday, he brought out the small parcel he had carried back from town the week before, wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table without explanation. Naira unfolded it carefully, revealing a length of calico cloth, gray with a hint of blue, soft to the touch. For the first time, Ethan saw her smile, not a polite flicker, but a real, small smile that reached her eyes. She touched the fabric, then looked at him. For me? He cleared his throat, nodding. Figured you could use it. That evening, she sat by the hearth, sewing the calico into a dress. Ethan watched her work, watched the way her hands moved, the way her hair fell over her shoulder. The sight made his chest tight with something he didn't yet know how to name. Later, when he went to check the barn, she followed with a lantern. The mare shifted in her stall, dust hanging in the dim light. Ethan turned to close the door, and Naira stood close behind him. Too close. The lantern flame caught the line of her face, the shine in her eyes, the neckline of her dress dipping where the seam had slipped. He froze, heart pounding in his ears. She didn't step back. Instead, she looked at him, waiting. Ethan swallowed, uncertain. He had never kissed a woman, never touched one with more than a handshake. And now she was standing close enough that her breath brushed his cheek. The decision pressed heavy. If he moved, it would change everything. If he didn't, he feared the chance would vanish. Slowly, almost clumsy, he raised his hand to her cheek. She leaned into it, eyes steady, and the lantern shook slightly in her grip. Ethan bent, hesitating only for a breath, then kissed her. It was not practiced or smooth, but it carried the weight of years of silence breaking. Naira answered softly, without fear, her lips warm against his. When they pulled apart, both stood still, unsteady in the quiet. She rested her forehead against his chest for a moment, and Ethan felt the heat of her through the thin fabric of his shirt. He held her lightly, not claiming, just anchoring. Back in the house, neither spoke of it. But everything had shifted. The silence now carried meaning it had never held before. Ethan knew listeners might still wonder, did he want her here only out of need, or because something deeper had begun? Did she trust him enough to stay? He didn't yet have the words, but he knew one thing with certainty. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. The days after that first kiss felt different, though neither of them spoke of it. Ethan rose earlier than usual, driven by a restless energy he couldn't quite name. He worked harder, faster, but still found his eyes straying toward the house when she wasn't near. Naira, too, seemed changed. She moved with the same quiet grace, but there was a new calm in her expression, as if she no longer braced herself for the moment she might be told to leave. Still, questions hung between them, the same ones anyone watching might ask. Was she safe here? Did others know she was staying with him? And if word spread, what would it bring? The answer came sooner than Ethan liked. On the third afternoon, dust rose on the far edge of his land. Two riders appeared, cutting across the dry wash toward the yard. Ethan set down the axe he had been using and wiped his palms on his trousers, unease already building in his chest. Men didn't ride out this way without reason. He reached for his rifle, the familiar weight steadying his hands. Naira stepped out of the house then, wiping her hands on her dress. She froze when she saw the riders and glanced at Ethan, reading his stance. Without a word, she retreated to the doorway, half in shadow, watching. The men reined up by the gate. Both were rough-looking, hats low over sunburnt faces, mouths bent into smirks. One leaned forward on his saddle horn, eyes roaming past Ethan toward the porch. "Afternoon," the rider called, voice slick. "Heard you had company out here." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Don't know what you heard." "Nothing out here but me." The second man chuckled, spitting into the dust. "Strange. Fella in town swore he saw an Apache woman trailing after you. Said maybe you'd taken in one of the strays." His grin widened. "Strays belong to whoever claims them first." Ethan lifted the rifle, not to aim but to rest it in plain sight against his hip. His voice came low. "You rode far enough. Turn back." The first rider leaned in his saddle, squinting toward the doorway where Naira stood. "She don't look like yours. Maybe we ought to ask her ourselves." Naira stepped forward then, slow and deliberate. She carried nothing but the iron fire poker she had been holding inside. She planted it against the porch rail like a staff, her chin high. Ethan felt a swell of something. Fear for her, pride in her steadiness, anger at the men who looked at her like property. "You heard me," Ethan said, steel in his tone. "Turn back." The silence that followed was tight, broken only by the shifting of the horses. The riders weighed him, his stance, the rifle he held steady. Finally, the second man snorted, reining his horse around. "Ain't worth it today." He threw a last glance at Naira. "But don't think she'll be safe out here forever." Dust kicked up behind them as they rode off. Ethan stayed still until they were no more than specks on the horizon. Only then did he lower the rifle. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sharp edge of rage he hadn't felt in years. Naira stepped down from the porch, still holding the poker. "They will come again," she said quietly. "Maybe," Ethan answered. He met her eyes. "But they won't take you." For a long moment, they stood there in the yard, the weight of the exchange pressing heavier than the sun. Ethan realized this wasn't only about shelter anymore. By letting her stay, by stepping in front of her now, he had taken a stand against more than hunger or loneliness. He had claimed a place for her beside him, even if no words had been spoken to name it. That night, after the animals were penned and the yard was still, they sat by the fire inside. Ethan sharpened his knife, though the blade hardly needed it. Naira mended again, the calico dress taking shape under her hands. The ordinary sounds, scraping steel, the thread pulling through cloth, carried a strange kind of peace. But Ethan knew things had changed. People in town knew she was here. Some would scorn him for it. Some might try worse. He thought of his father's hard voice, warning him never to bring strangers into his home. And for once, Ethan felt no weight from it. The old man had left him nothing but silence. What sat across from him now, quiet and steady in the firelight, was more than he had ever dared to want. When their eyes met, neither looked away. The unspoken truth between them was clear. Whatever came next, she was his to protect, and he was her only safe ground. The night after the riders came, The house held a different weight. Ethan sat by the fire long after the flames had burned low, turning the rifle over in his lap. He had told himself for years that keeping quiet, keeping alone, was enough to keep him safe. But now, with Naira asleep only steps away, he understood it wasn't just his safety on the line anymore. He could still hear the words the men had left behind. Strays belong to whoever claims them first. And it twisted his stomach with anger he couldn't shake. Naira stirred by the hearth, shifting in her blanket, then opened her eyes. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You are worried." Ethan didn't deny it. "They'll be back. Or someone else will." She pushed herself up, the calico dress she had been sewing draped across her lap. "If I leave, they won't trouble you." The thought hit him hard. He set the rifle aside, voice sharper than he meant. "No, you're not leaving." The silence stretched. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Why?" she asked, her tone calm, almost testing him. It was the very question listeners would wonder too. Why would a man who had lived alone so long suddenly risk everything to keep her? Ethan swallowed. He didn't have the words ready, but he found them slowly. "Because I want you here. Because this land feels different with you in it." Her face softened, the faintest trace of relief passing across it. She nodded once, then folded the dress carefully beside her. The fire cracked low, and she came closer, sitting at the edge of his cot. Ethan's chest tightened. He had kissed her once in the barn, but this was different. There was no excuse of dust or closeness, just choice. He reached out, hesitating, brushing her hair back from her face. His hand trembled slightly. Every touch was new to him. Naira leaned into it, steadying him with her calm. She placed her hand over his, then drew him closer. Their lips met again, this time slower, deeper, with none of the clumsiness of the first. Ethan felt the world narrow to the heat of her mouth, the weight of her hand sliding against his chest. They lay back together on the cot, the blanket falling aside. Ethan's breath came rough, nerves and want tangling inside him, but Naira guided him with patience, her own touch sure. For Ethan, it was everything he had never known. The warmth of another body against his, the press of skin, the quiet sounds of being wanted without scorn. He realized with startling clarity that this was the first time in his life he had felt truly alive. When it was over, they lay tangled in silence, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm curled protectively around her. The firelight flickered across the walls, soft and steady. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his heartbeat slowly easing, and thought of how far he had come from the man who found her collapsed at his fence line. Naira shifted slightly, her voice quiet but certain. "You do not have to be alone anymore." Ethan turned to look at her. The truth of her words sank into him. He had spent his life believing solitude was all he would ever have. Now, here she was, offering something he hadn't even dared to imagine. He kissed her forehead gently, holding her close. "Neither do you," he said. The questions that had lingered from the first chapters, would he trust her enough to let her in? Would she choose to stay? Would their bond grow beyond survival? Were no longer questions. The answers were in the warmth of the bed they now shared, in the quiet certainty of their breathing together, and in the simple fact that neither of them was turning away. By morning, the farm would look the same, the fences and fields unchanged. But the life inside the small house had shifted forever. Ethan Cole was no longer just a man living alone in silence. He was a man who had chosen, at last, to let someone in, and she had chosen to remain. By the time spring edged across the Arizona land, the farm no longer felt like the lonely stretch of dirt Ethan had known. The willows by the wash carried pale green. The soil softened under the plow, and the days were no longer justice to reckon with. There was another set of hands in the work, another voice, quiet but steady, in the house. Where once the mornings had been empty but for his own footsteps, now he woke with Naira beside him, the warmth of her body anchoring him to a life he hadn't dared to believe he could have. Yet questions still lingered, the kind any listener might ask. Had they bound themselves to each other in truth? Or was she still a guest who might walk away once she could stand firmly again? Would the town continue to whisper and send trouble their way? And most of all, what would Ethan do to prove that what they shared wasn't temporary, but something permanent? The answers began to take form in the rhythm of the days. Naira no longer kept to the shadows. She moved openly through the yard, feeding chickens, turning earth with her bare feet, carrying water with a strength that returned more each day. She wore the calico dress she had sewn, the neckline cut low by her choice, her hair braided and tied with feathers. When Ethan watched her, he no longer felt the same conflicted caution he once had. He felt pride and the heavy responsibility of keeping her safe whatever might come. One morning, Ethan saddled the mare and rode into town alone. He hadn't told Naira why. The general store was quiet, only a few men on the porch who stopped talking when he tied off his horse. He bought salt, flour, and coffee as always, but then asked the clerk for the paper that recorded homestead names. The clerk raised a brow but fetched it, and Ethan spelled it out, slow and deliberate. Naira Cole. He wrote her name next to his, steady hand pressing each letter into the page. For the first time, the farm carried more than one name in law as well as in life. When he returned that evening, Naira was sitting on the porch steps, mending his shirt. She looked up at him, her expression calm, but her eyes searching. He dismounted, handed her the parcel, and sat down beside her. He didn't speak at first, only watched her fold the cloth. At last, he said, "It's yours too, the farm," in writing. She stared at him, blinking once, twice, before lowering her gaze to the ground. When she lifted it again, her eyes glistened. "You would do that for me?" Ethan's voice was firm. "Not for you. For us." She nodded slowly, then placed her hand over his. That simple act said more than words ever could. That night, they built something new together. Ethan had gathered rough planks of cedar, and side by side they sawed, hammered, and shaped until a wider table stood in the center of the room. He burned 2 small letters in the underside with a hot nail, E for Ethan, N for Naira. When they turned it upright and set their cups on it, it felt more permanent than any vow. In the days that followed, their bond became visible in small ways. They planted side by side, measuring rows with twine. She laughed quietly when he misstepped in the furrow, a sound he hadn't known he needed until it was there. In the evenings, they sat on the porch while the sky burned low, his arm resting around her shoulders without hesitation now. The men from before never returned, but word drifted in town. Some whispered, some scoffed, some turned their eyes away when Ethan walked down the street. But others gave him nods of respect. He no longer carried himself as the withdrawn farmer who spoke to no one. He carried himself as a man who had something worth defending. For Ethan, the truth was plain now. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a stray he had taken in. She was his partner, his woman, the one who had turned his silence into a life. And though he had no preacher's blessing or paper with a gold seal, he knew their bond was stronger than either. That night, when they lay together in the fire's glow, Naira whispered the question she had carried since the first day. "Will they come again?" Ethan tightened his arm around her, pressing his lips to her hair. "Maybe," he said, "but if they do, they'll find us together." And with that, the last of the doubts that had followed them since the day she collapsed at his fence line seemed to fade. They were no longer 2 souls surviving side by side. They were one, building a home that no one else had the right to take. Spring settled fully over the land, and with it came a sense of permanence Ethan had never felt before. The soil, once hard and lifeless under his boots, now carried the beginnings of rows they had planted together. Shoots of corn and beans pushed through the earth, and each evening he and Naira walked the line side by side, her bare feet sinking softly into the damp ground. To anyone watching, it would be clear this was no longer just a farmer's lonely land. It was their home, but there were still unanswered questions that had lingered from the very beginning. Would the outside world continue to trouble them? Would Naira always feel like a stranger here, or would she truly belong? And for Ethan himself, who had lived without a woman's touch or presence all his life, was he ready to admit that what they had built was not only survival, but love? The first of those questions found its answer when Ethan rode into town once more. He stopped at the general store for supplies, as always, But this time he did not lower his eyes when men on the porch fell silent. He met their stares squarely, shoulders steady, and when one asked outright, "You still got that woman out there?" Ethan's reply came plain and sharp. "Her name's Naira. She's my wife now, in all ways that matter." He left it at that. There were no more jeers, no laughter, only silence that carried a different weight than before. Respect, or at least recognition. When he returned home, Naira was waiting by the porch, a basin of water set aside, her hands damp from washing. Ethan dismounted and took her hand without hesitation. "They know," he said. She studied his face, and he allowed himself the faintest smile. "And it doesn't matter." That night, he showed her what he had done. From a cedar post at the edge of the yard, where the trail met his land, he had carved and burned words with a hot iron. Coal farm. Beneath it, two names, Ethan and Naira. She traced the letters slowly with her fingers, her eyes shining in the firelight. For the first time since he had found her half dead in the dust, her shoulders eased fully, as though she had laid down the last of the weight she had been carrying. Their bond, once hesitant, now carried the rhythm of a family being built. She wore the calico dress she had sewn, cut low by her own choice, no longer ashamed of her body or her place here. He no longer kept his distance, no longer pretended his life was enough without her. In the evenings they sat at the table they had made together, their cups side by side, their names carved into the wood beneath. One evening, as they prepared the fields for planting a second row, Naira stood with a hand against her stomach, thoughtful. Ethan noticed the gesture, concern flickering across his face. She caught his expression and smiled faintly. "Perhaps, by next spring, there'll be more than two of us here." The word struck him with both surprise and an overwhelming sense of rightness. He had never imagined fatherhood, never thought himself the kind of man to hold a family, but now the image filled him with quiet certainty. "Then we'll be ready," he said firmly. By the time summer approached, there were no more questions left unanswered. The strangers who once mocked him had not returned. The farm stood strong, the roof patched, the fences sound. The law carried her name as much as his, and the land bore their sweat equally. Most of all, the silence between them, once tense and guarded, had become a comfort, a language all their own. On a soft evening, the sun sinking low beyond the wash, Ethan and Naira walked the boundary together. They stopped at the cedar post, looking out at the horizon. She slipped her hand into his, and he held it tightly, grounding them both. "This is home," she said, her voice steady. "It is," Ethan answered. And with that, the story that began with a broken woman in the dust and a man too wary to let her near had come full circle. She was no longer a cast-off wanderer, and he was no longer the lonely farmer no one remembered. Together, they had built a life, and they had chosen to stay in it, side by side, without fear, without doubt. The quiet stretched out across the land, not empty but full. For the first time, Ethan Cole's life was not silence. It was family, it was love, and it would last.